The battle for the White House heats up as the U.S. presidential election draws closer. Hello, I'm Anand Naidu, and this is The Heat. With less than 50 days left before the U.S. presidential election, President Trump and his challenger, Joe Biden, are ramping up their attacks on one another. Biden took part in a CNN town hall event on Thursday night, and he slammed Trump for not doing enough to tackle the coronavirus pandemic. Meanwhile, President Trump says the U.S. is getting closer to having a COVID-19 vaccine. He's pushing a law and order message as well, and claims that a Biden presidency would be a disaster for the United States. Well, there's lots to discuss. Joining us now in Washington, D.C. is Hamza Khan. He is a Democratic Party strategist and political activist. Also with us is John Sitilides. He is a government affairs specialist and consultant to the U.S. State Department. With us, too, from Washington, D.C. is Steve Chaggaris. He is a journalist and political analyst. And joining us as well is CGTN's White House correspondent, Nathan King. Welcome to all of you. Nathan, let's start with you, and let's start with a foreign policy issue, and that is China. The president has been talking about China. He continues to take a very hard stance on China. There have been developments in the past 24 hours. What can you tell us, and can you make the connection between what he's talking about and his messaging during this campaign?
Yeah, absolutely. Listen, there has been a complete change since January the 15th. You and I were talking about it here, the phase one a trade deal, signing at the White House, and literally that was when COVID started. And let's face it, it's all gone downhill from there. Despite early praise for President Xi and the response in China, it very quickly developed when the virus hit here into the China virus, the Kong flu, all this sort of very, you could say racist rhetoric, but also a ramping up of anti-China policies from China hawks within his administration, like Mike Pompeo, the current Secretary of State, but others as well. We've seen a sort of a zenith of that, if you like, over the last 24 hours with TikTok and WeChat, even though the headlines in the US say it's banned, there is wiggle room, but you get my feeling. We've seen it with Xinjiang, we've seen it with Hong Kong, we're seeing it increasingly with Taiwan, by the way, and I think that's one of the under-reported stories of the Trump administration as we go into the election. Look, he played the China card going into 2016. He thinks it can work again. Let's see how that happens. I can tell you in terms of polling, China is pretty far down the list in terms of people's domestic worries here. Of course, COVID is top, economy, healthcare. The deflection may work a little bit with his supporters. It doesn't seem to be working in the polls. The question is whether that policy against China continues into a second Trump administration if he wins, or a lame duck period and into Joe Biden's presidency.
Right, Nathan, as you say, China is very low down the list of voters' priorities. But when he talks about China, is the intention here to say that, look, China's to blame for this COVID-19 pandemic, not me?
Yeah, pretty much. He won't say it explicitly. He's got surrogates for doing that. If you've seen Mike Pompeo's speeches, if you listen to Peter Navarro, who is a doctor, I think, but not of medicine, economics, and most economists think he's not a very good one. He's been pushing China did this. In fact, they don't even say China. They say the Communist Party spread this. Now, look, were there initial mistakes in China? They didn't know whether. Yeah, sure, we can talk about this. But let's face it. Pretty much around the world in February, people knew what they were dealing with. Look at Taiwan's response. Look at Vietnam's response, etc., etc. New Zealand. The fact that there are 200,000 deaths here, 6.5 million cases, nearly 7 million cases. Look. It's an election year. You get my drift?
I certainly do. Let's go to Hamza Khan. Hamza, President Trump has been campaigning. He continues to campaign. Let's listen to part of what he had to say this week.
If Biden wins, very simple, China wins. If Biden wins, the mob wins. If Biden wins, the rioters, anarchists, arsonists, and flag burners, they win. And we're not into flag burners.
So, Hamza, the president here is deploying fear tactics. Are they going to work?
No, because this is a president who has been using fear for the last several years to maintain a grip on power, and as a result, he lost the midterm elections in 2018. And on top of that, and when it comes down to the issue of law and order, there has not been a more lawless president in recent history rather than Donald Trump. Let's not forget Michael Flynn is in jail, Michael Cohen is in jail, several of his closest allies on the Hill are under investigation and within the White House. He's had a huge number of aides leave the White House because of the high levels of corruption. This is not a man who anyone wants to be standing next to in the United States of America. At this point in time, I'm more than convinced that Donald Trump is headed for a terrible election loss in November, God willing.
Yeah, just on that question of law and order, Hamza, maybe we need some clarification here. When President Trump, or for that matter, Joe Biden, talk about law and order, and they talk about being the law and order candidates, isn't this a not so subtle message to voters that we are going to keep blacks in their place if you elect us?
I don't believe that's true in the case of Joe Biden. I think the issue is that law and order comes down to corruption issues for the Democratic Party. This has probably been the most corrupt administration in Washington since the founding of the country. So I think when Joe Biden is talking about law and order, he's talking about returning checks and balances to our constitutional system of government. When it comes to Donald Trump, it's absolutely about keeping black people, as you put it, in their place. And it's also about making sure that immigrants and minorities within this country live in a world of fear, and that white privileged men like himself can get away with continuing to engage in sexual harassment and assault of women of all races and backgrounds.
All right, let's go to John Sitilides. John, Joe Biden did a town hall on CNN this week. It was a very unusual format. It was a drive-in town hall with very few people in the audience. He went after the president's handling of the coronavirus pandemic. Let's listen to what Joe Biden said.
This is all about one thing, the stock market. He doesn't want to see anything happen. It's all about his reelection. It should be about the American people, and they're in trouble. And if we don't do it, and by the way, his own CDC director contradicted him recently. He said, if in fact you just wore this mask, nothing else but this mask, you would save between now and January another 100,000 lives.
John, on the question of the president's handling of the pandemic, how vulnerable is his candidacy right here? Because we've seen poll after poll tell us that the American people believe that he's handled this very badly.
Well, I first would like Anand to address points made by the two prior speakers.
Yep.
To Nathan's point about the future of U.S.-China relations, my own sense is that the two countries are very much already in a Cold War, and it will continue either under a second Trump administration or even a Biden administration, although the tone will be very different. It's a larger discussion, but I think that we are going into a very serious, difficult, challenging period in the bilateral relationship. And I also would like to comment on your question to the prior speaker. I would take exception to the idea that anything that's coming out of the White House is about putting a certain group of people in their place. Donald Trump, as a matter of fact, is on path right now to possibly achieve 15 to 20% of the black vote, which is historic for a Republican. And black unemployment and Hispanic unemployment were at their lowest in a half-century under his presidency. So I think we need to be very careful about
Obama's economic policies has nothing to do with Donald J. Trump's policies whatsoever.
Hamza, I'll get to you. John, finish what you were saying.
So I just want to be very clear here that we need to be factual, and we really should be honest about what is happening around the country before getting into these kinds of scurrilous comments. Now, about the Biden remarks, yeah, I think it's wise for Joe Biden to go after Donald Trump because there is a serious debate in the United States about the way the White House has dealt with COVID. But I think that also misses the point that it wasn't just the White House. We have 50 states, and many governors, starting with Andrew Cuomo, were absolutely disastrous in their decisions. One might argue that Andrew Cuomo's decision on nursing homes probably directly led to the deaths of 8,000 to 10,000 elderly people in New York. So lots of blame to go around, but we're still learning how to do this in Europe, which also has several 100,000 deaths.
Right.
India, several 100,000 deaths. Tens of thousands in Brazil. So the idea that somehow the U.S. is alone in trying to figure out how to deal with this virus that did start in China, and if China helped us discover the origins of the virus, maybe we could have collaborated universally to deal with this issue in a much more effective manner.
All right, Hamza, go ahead.
Let me just start by saying that there's nothing more scurrilous than a president of the United States ducking behind skirts and avoiding the job he has in front of him, which is protecting American lives. With 6 to 7 million people infected with this illness, 200,000 people dead, including my own personal uncle, my close uncle, I can tell you right now that it's an insult to the American people that your last speaker tries to call anything out about that to be scurrilous. Now, moving up forward, talking about the election and dealing with the issues in front of us, one thing we need to keep in mind right now is that Donald Trump is doing anything he can to throw the kitchen sink at his opponents and try to win this election. So far, he hasn't really hit the mark, and I don't think he really will. When it comes down to it, blaming 50 states for not being able to handle a national security matter, which the president should have had in handle from the very beginning, and after interviews with Bob Woodward that have come out, he was quite aware of how dangerous this virus was. I don't think he has a prayer in heaven of getting out of this. I think he's in serious trouble.
All right, let me bring in Steve Chaggaris. Steve, good to have you on the show. We've got less than 50 days to go to this election. How do you see the race shaping up right now? If we look at the polls, it seems Biden's doing pretty well. Is it looking better for him?
Well, it's just one thing that I've noticed is on a day-to-day basis, the president seems to be playing defense. And, you know, there's just very little good news that is coming the president's way. And even when there is good news, for instance, with what happened with his Middle East signing this week, it gets stepped on by other news. He goes to a town hall that night and takes some tough questions and has trouble getting out of that. So he doesn't have a lot of opportunities, or he hasn't had a lot of opportunities to really generate some a good news cycle for himself. He's constantly on defense, constantly talking about COVID. He's trying to spin COVID in a positive way, but Americans are not buying it, at least according to the polls. He had an opportunity, or at least he thought he had an opportunity with the law and order message. He thought that he would be able to maybe shore up older voters who have drifted from the president, or suburban voters who have drifted from the president by talking about law and order. And then when Wisconsin came around, he went out there, as did Joe Biden, and the polling numbers didn't change. They don't think that the president can handle these issues about protests and riots the way he is saying he can handle them. And so ultimately what winds up happening is the numbers are stagnant. Joe Biden finds himself in a situation where as long as Donald Trump continues to generate bad news for himself, Joe Biden doesn't have to really get in the way and do much.
John, what's your response to that? I mean, is there a plan in place here? I mean, what is the kind of coalition that the president is trying to build here to win this election?
Well, I'm not so sure that he's in as much trouble as others seem to believe. And remember, we're relying for the most part on polls that were catastrophically wrong in 2016, right? They were predicting Hillary Clinton would win by 90% or 90% chance of winning the presidency. And if you look at some of the polls that were very reliable in 16 and 18, Anand, the Trafalgar poll and the Rasmussen polls, they're actually showing the race is tightening. I think it's very difficult to predict today where this is going, but we're looking really at about a half a dozen, maybe to 8 battleground states, and it's tight in most of those states.
Right.
And the national polls are pretty meaningless because those are really being weighed by superior antipathy towards Trump by voters in California and New York, which is why the national polls really aren't very useful here. But the battleground states, this thing is getting tight.
Nathan, I know you want to say something on the polls.
Yeah, sorry, John.
Yeah, I know you want to say something on the polls, Nathan. Go ahead, and then I want to ask you something about Joe Biden's town hall performance. Go ahead.
John, with all due respect, we've been on many shows together. I respect your opinion, but they are not tightening. I mean, you could look at Pennsylvania, maybe it is tightening a little bit. Have you seen the Arizona poll? Arizona has not gone for a Democrat in, what, 100 years? 8 points ahead or something like that. Wisconsin, widening against the president. Minnesota, where essentially the president is hoping to gain to offset any loss in Pennsylvania, Michigan, or Wisconsin. That is not happening. There are even worries about North Carolina, and dare I say it, Georgia, South Carolina. I'm not going to mention the T word, but you know where I'm going. This is not a good polling for a candidate who polls better with the country than Hillary Clinton ever did.
Okay. All right.
I just want to say something about the polls.
Yeah.
You know, the difference, I think, between 2020 and 2016 in terms of polling is, first of all, we can't look at any polling that's happening now as what's predictive of what's going to happen in 40 some odd days.
I think we can.
It's not a predictor. It's a state of play.
That's what polls are. They predict. by the way.
Well, they're not supposed to be seen as predictors. They're states of play
What
at
are
the
polls for,
moment.
then?
But my point
Okay,
is
one at a
this.
time, please. Steve,
My point is this.
What,
In 20,
he says
in
polls
20
aren't predictors. They are predictors. That's exactly why we have polls.
Okay, Steve, finish your thought.
Okay, my point is this, though. In 2020, the difference between 2020 and 2016 is in 2016, there were a lot more people who were making up their minds late in the game. And we saw that in places like Wisconsin and Michigan, where people made up their minds. I think it was 13 or 14% in each state had made up their minds in the final week. So you can't really poll those people 3 weeks out. Again, that's why it was difficult to predict those states a month in advance. 2020, what we're seeing is very few undecideds, very few people leaning toward third parties, and Joe Biden showing up in the polls at close to or above 50% in a lot of these polls. That was not happening with Hillary Clinton, and that was definitely not happening overall with 2016. So
Can I
think
chip in here?
that
Also, Trump was lucky in 2016. You know, regardless of what this White House says, less than 80,000 votes spread across 3 states. That is very, very close. Don't look at the Electoral College. Look at those numbers, because essentially less than 1% in 2 of those 3 states. That is not happening right now. Right. So that's going to be very interesting. And that's why you're seeing a lot of the polling rhetoric that you're and voting rhetoric that you're getting from this White House, because they know they're in trouble.
Nathan, I want to ask you about the town hall. Joe Biden was in a CNN town hall. He presented himself as a man of the people, tried to differentiate himself from Donald Trump by saying he's an ordinary guy. Let's listen to what he said.
Yeah.
Oh, grow up here in Scranton. We're used to guys who look down their nose at us. We're looked at people who look at us and think that we're suckers. Look at us and they think that we're not equivalent to them. If you didn't have a college degree, you must be stupid. If, in fact, you didn't get to go to an Ivy school. Well, I tell you what bothered me, to tell you the truth. Maybe it's my Scranton roots, I don't know. But when you guys started talking on television about Biden, if he wins, will be the first person without a Ivy League degree to be elected president, I'm thinking, who the hell makes you think I have to have an Ivy League degree to be president? I really mean it.
Nathan, is this a tactic that's going to work? Well, you know, especially in places like Wisconsin or Pennsylvania.
It's not a bad talking point. Scranton, Pennsylvania versus Park Avenue. Both are untrue, of course. He was in Scranton, Pennsylvania for a very early part of his life and then moved to Wilmington, Delaware. And, of course, Trump is not from Park Avenue. He's from Jamaica, Queens, and then moved to Fifth Avenue with that rather ostentatious tower. But it's not bad at all, because a lot of Trump's rhetoric about the recovery is based on the stock market, not about the average guy in the street. And he made that point after saying that quote that, you know, who do you know that owns stocks? 50% of people I know in Scranton don't own stocks. And that's very important, because Trump ran very much on the disaffected blue-collar class, especially where you saw him pick up those 80,000 votes, like I mentioned, in Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, and Michigan. And if basically Biden can take that and maybe 10,000 more, then that's fine. The Green candidate has dropped, is now out in Pennsylvania as well. That's a big deal. The one point here is that Joe Biden needs to really prove to the left of the party that it's not just about this sort of battle in the middle. Because remember, Hillary Clinton did not do a good job of getting out the progressive, because of the war with Bernie Sanders, did not do a good job of getting people of color out, especially in Pennsylvania. I'm talking about Pittsburgh, I'm talking about Philadelphia, I'm talking about Detroit. It seems like Biden's doing better with those people, but he does have a problem with Latinos in Florida and Texas. So it's going to be very interesting.
Anand, can I jump in here?
Yeah, sure, go ahead.
So a couple of things here. First of all, I think this is the first time in my lifetime that I've seen a completely non-Ivy slate on the left. And I think that's really important. That's a talking point that people aren't looking at enough. I think Vice President Biden's bringing it up now, but I think it's actually resonating, to the point of Nathan, with the left. A lot of young people in this country are not products of Ivy League educations, and over the past decade have watched their parents suffer at the hands of an economy that seems to favor elites. And so I think that, believe it or not, this is going to be a talking point that does begin to resonate with young people more and more who are towards the left and are in the progressive camp. Now, going over to Philadelphia and Pennsylvania, looking over that whole map over there in terms of getting minority voters to the polls and immigrant voters to the polls, I think there's a galvanization of this entire electorate to show up simply because Donald Trump has proven himself to be such an enemy of working people, immigrant communities, and minorities. And to the point of Latinos in Florida and Texas, I'm not really sure that's going to be the most key part of this coalition this time around. I really think that if we're looking at Wisconsin, Minnesota, and Michigan, I think that the VP has a really good shot at winning those states over, and along with Pennsylvania, much more than Hillary Clinton did last time around. And I think it's simply because the enthusiasm amongst that part of the base has shifted. We talk a lot about Trump having a lot of enthusiasm in his base.
Yeah.
If you start looking at immigrants and minorities, they are just as enthusiastic to see Donald Trump gone, and those are key coalition partners in these several states.
John, what are your thoughts on these groups of voters that both candidates will be going after?
Well, rather than break it down in terms of this demographic and this other demographic, I think it's very important to keep in mind that in several weeks, we'll have the data in on the third quarter GDP growth. And as we know, the United States and almost every country in the world suffered an abysmal decline in GDP in the spring. But the sense is that we may have high single digits, maybe even low double-digit GDP annualized growth for July, August, and September. And that puts the president in a much stronger position to sell to the American people the message that, yes, we've all suffered grievously under these COVID lockdowns and the economic lockdowns, but building the economy again is something that can be entrusted to Donald Trump rather than to Joe Biden. And I think the law and order argument and the economic growth arguments will, again, continue to sharpen and to tighten the races in these battleground states. Even with this debate that we're having here, this race is only going to get tighter over the next 6 weeks.
Steve, lest we forget, early voting has already started, mail-in voting has already started, but the president has said that what he calls these unsolicited mail in balloting is a, quote, scam. Let's listen to what President Trump said.
But we have a lot of very important decisions coming down on this, on the scam of unsolicited ballots, where they're sending out tens of millions of ballots to everybody, people that didn't expect them. People are getting inundated with ballots. They'll be showered with ballots. Everybody in this room knows it's a scam.
So, Steve, the president has been talking about mail-in balloting mail-in ballots rather for some time. What's the strategy here, do you think? Is he trying to delegitimize those votes and effectively the conduct of the election?
I think ultimately, yes, that's what he was trying to do. But, you know, he's been talking about this issue for months. He's been all over the place on this issue, first talking about absentee ballots, then mail-in ballots. Now he's talking about unsolicited ballots. They're all different things. And the reason why he's now shifted to talking about unsolicited ballots is because people in the Republican Party, including people who are running for re-election to the Senate and the House, are saying, stop talking about this because actually some of our voters are going to use mail-in voting. And so now he's shifted to unsolicited ballots, which are going to be the 10 states that will just send ballots to every registered voter. 5 of those states have been doing it for years without any incident. It's 5 new states that are doing it. So at the end of the day, it's become a much smaller argument for him, but he's still trying to use this as a cudgel to say this is going to delegitimize the outcome. I think what we saw with early voting today, in places like Virginia, you saw people, in-person early voting started in Virginia today, and there were lines down the street in some of these precincts. And you heard anecdotally people waiting in line saying, well, I'm not sure I trust the mail. I'd rather just make sure that my vote counts, so I'm going to go and I'll wait in line for 3 hours to make sure my vote counts. We're talking 45 days before an election, people standing in line to do it. So this whole argument about mail-in may actually be backfiring on him if Democrats are going to line up in person early to just go ahead and vote in person.
John, sorry, who was that?
That was Hamza. May I jump in, or are we out of time?
Yeah, sure, go ahead.
I was going to say, on top of all of that, I would want to point out that if this became a contested election, constitutionally, this goes to the House of Representatives, which in its current makeup is not exactly on Donald Trump's side, and after January probably will also not be on his side. So I'm not really sure where the president is trying to go with this line of logic. It's just going to do him harm either way.
All right, John, I want to get to something else, and that is...
Can I just interrupt?
Yeah, quickly.
Actually, if it is contested, it goes to the House of Representatives that essentially will be seated on January 6th, which is before the president being seated on January 20th.
Right.
Sorry. It's really complicated. I would suggest people reading in on this, but if there are contentions, especially from this Donald Trump White House, don't necessarily think that it's actually going to go in his favor. It could actually be even worse for him.
All right, that's something else. But John, I'm going to get into the debates, the upcoming debates. Of course, we'll be watching that very closely. And when you look at Joe Biden's performance during the CNN town hall, do you think that will assure voters that he will be able to take on Donald Trump in the debates?
I'm not sure, Anand. You raise a very good question, because I think there's two things that are happening here on the part of the Biden campaign. One is to lower expectations as much as possible, so that if he gets by without the kind of quartermaster comments that he made earlier this week that were very confusing to voters, I think people will say, well, he was able to pull this off vis-a-vis Trump. But I think the larger dilemma he's having is the CNN program. Even his supporters have criticized CNN for the softball questions that he's being asked versus kind of very tough grilling that Trump took with the George Stephanopoulos event on Tuesday. Yeah. They're not doing Biden a service by throwing these softball, these marshmallow questions at him. He needs to be challenged in a public setting. And remember, these debates are, I think, an hour and a half each. Yeah. So they're also physically grueling. So I think he'd be better served if reporters asked him tough questions, not to trip him up, but to prepare him for what Donald Trump will surely try to do, and that's machete him when it comes to challenges and probably increasing attacks on Biden's working class stature. Photos of his $6 million mansion in McLean, his family being enriched. Trump is going to go after him from every which direction, and I don't think Biden is ready for it.
Okay. Steve, that interview that John just referenced, that was the President's appearance on the United States network ABC News. He was interviewed by George Stephanopoulos, and many critics panned the president's performance in that, said he didn't do very well. So how key are these upcoming debates? And one other point, I mean, we're seeing voting taking place before the first debate.
Yeah, so just speaking to the town hall from this week, it felt like it was a group of angry customers going up to the manager at the store complaining. And he just was, we don't see the president really interacting with voters in that kind of setting very much at all. It's really sort of out of character for him to be talking to voters in that way. And I wonder, it's just not something that he's very good at. And so I think that's part of the reason why it looked the way it did at the end of the day. But in terms of the debates, now we've heard the president say he's not going to really prepare for the debates. He's not going to do any mock debates and much debate prep, which I wonder if that's a great strategy, only because, one, a mock debate will allow him to tighten up his talking points with Biden and deal with the technical part of it, which is staying within time. Right. But the other part of it is Trump for months has been talking about Joe Biden's not up to the task of being president. He should be in a home somewhere. Right. And lowered the bar for Biden. So we'll see how that goes.
Yeah, we got to go. We've run out of time. We got to go. Thanks to all of you for being with us. And that is where we have to leave it. Thanks for joining us on another edition of The Heat.